30 seconds.
Okay. Make sure our I'm Cathy Glasson, opinion editor for the Register, and we're here for an interview with Nate Boulton, one of 6 candidates for the Democratic nomination for governor. The winner of the June 5 primary will face Republican Kim Reynolds in November. Senator Boulton, welcome. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, let's go around the room and introduce all the other Register reporters and editors who are here.
Carol Hunter, executive editor.
Rika Basu, opinion columnist.
Brianne Bonensteel, political reporter.
Bill Petrowski, reporter.
David Shivers, president.
And joining us is Rachel Stossenberger, politics
Political
editor. So tell us a little bit about yourself and especially what qualifies you to be governor of Iowa.
Yeah, well, first I want to say thanks again for the opportunity to have this discussion. I think one of the most important things in terms of running for governor is being able to talk about issues in depth, and I think it's something that's important for deciding the Democratic nominee as well as who should be our governor at the end of the day. I'm someone who grew up in southeast Iowa. Columbus Junction is my hometown. My mom and stepdad still live on a heritage farm just outside of Columbus Junction. My dad came out of a Union Tire plant in Muscatine. His father, my grandfather, spent 20 years as the chief union steward on the floor at Rath Packing House in Columbus Junction. So the tradition of standing up for workplace rights goes back generations in my family. I'm someone who grew up in that small town of Columbus Junction, but now I represent one of the more urban districts of our state in East Des Moines and Pleasant Hill in the Iowa Senate. I ran for the Iowa Senate because I wanted to see us do the things we should do in Iowa to enhance the quality of life for working families, people like my parents and grandparents. When I got there, unfortunately, I saw an agenda playing out that did just the opposite. That actually made a priority of taking away and holding back from those people that we need to succeed in Iowa's economy for our whole state to be successful. That really is what got me into this race for governor. It was the catalyst for me deciding that I was going to get in this race because after a full year of saying no, after a full year of standing up and trying to challenge some of the things that were taking our state in the wrong direction, I looked at the yes-no buttons on my desk in the Iowa Senate, and that was the moment that I really decided, you know what, I'm going to do everything I can so we can start pushing forward an agenda and something that I'd be proud to say yes to in this state again. And so far we've visited 99 counties in the campaign, built a strong campaign that I'm very proud of going into this primary election, and really started to focus on what should be the major concern of Iowans, and that is what should our state look like for the next generation, something that's been lost right now.
You've been, we're just coming out of a contentious legislative session. You yourself have been highly critical of the Republican majority in the Senate. If you're governor and they're still in charge, how are you going to work with them?
Well, I think that's one of the critical things about legislative experience as we look to the next governor in Iowa. I think having that experience of working with members of both parties, working with the House and Senate as individual representatives and senators, knowing them and being able to talk with them to build the coalition that you need to get a legislative agenda accomplished is going to be important for the next governor. I'm someone that, despite the hyper-partisan environment and despite the headlines that we've seen where I have stood up to some of the things that I disagree with very strongly, I've also been able to get some things done in the legislative process. There haven't been a whole lot of Democrats who've been able to offer and successfully pass amendments to legislation. I've done that 3 times, even partnering with Republicans to do that. So I think that's going to be critical as we look at ways to make the state better, to get beyond the talking points, to actually enact a positive vision forward, is getting it through the legislative process.
Give us an example. What were some of those amendments that you were able to get passed?
Well, one of the things that I'm probably most proud of was actually last session, the session before this one that just ended. where Senator Guth, a very conservative Republican from North Iowa, was floor managing a bill that dealt with volunteer firefighters who also serve on city councils. And I identified a potential unintended consequence of that bill. It basically would have, in my opinion, made it so someone who answers the call of public service twice for their community would be the only one at a fire scene that, if they were injured, wouldn't get the compensation they need for the lost wages and the hospital bills that they would incur. So rather than sitting back and waiting for the bad thing to happen, I actually approached with an amendment and ended up having the Guth-Boulton amendment passed unanimously by the legislature. So I think that's going to be key to identifying problems and working towards solutions. And I think that's going to be important in terms of policy decisions down the line.
What do you think is the best thing that the legislature did this year?
There have been a number of things that I voted in favor of, and I even went to the bill signing on the complex needs mental health bill. I think that was a major step forward. We have a lot of major steps forward that are needed in mental health care, but I think that's something that was a positive step in the right direction. That's why you saw bipartisan support for it. And I think there are a lot of bipartisan steps we can take forward, particularly in issues like mental health, where all of Iowa really sees a need to do more in terms of giving citizens adequate access to health care and mental health care in their communities, as well as those with the most severe mental illness.
There were concerns raised that the mental health bill just didn't include the money
Right.
to make the worthwhile goals, you know, a certain thing, a sure thing, a reality.
Right.
So, what would be your next steps, assuming that this mental health bill was not the one and done? You know,
Correct.
what are the next steps?
Yeah, so it's a lot of that, right? We took a step in the right direction, but it doesn't matter if we don't take the next step, which is funding the resources that are needed to provide adequate access to mental health in communities. It's the same thing with the suicide training bill for teachers. I think it's great that we help teachers identify what the warning signs are for a student that may be at risk of taking his or her own life, but we also have to make sure that student, that child, gets access to a children's mental health network. So if it is, instead of an acute issue that has happened, it's something that is a sustained mental illness issue, they get the care they need beyond just that one intervention. So things like that are important. And I think the budgeting process is where that has to be taken seriously. One of the bills that I offered would have forced reopening 2 of our state's 4 mental health facilities, something that before I was even in the Iowa legislature I was fighting for. I took on the case when Branstad and Reynolds shut down 2 of our state's 4 mental health facilities and did nothing to replace those lost services. I took on the case on behalf of the workers that worked in those facilities who were unfairly criticized and attacked for the work that they were doing, and the people that are the most vulnerable in terms of mental illness in our state, the ones with the most severe cases of mental illness, the ones that need that 24/7 care and supervision. This administration shut down 2 of those facilities, did nothing to replace the lost services, and I was proud to argue in front of the Supreme Court to keep those open. And then when I got to the Iowa Senate, introduced legislation that would have reopened those facilities.
When you talk about reopening those facilities, is that something that would still be a priority if you were governor? Or given the amount of money it takes to run those facilities, would that be better put into better community-based services?
Well, what I really struggle with is the fact that we keep acting as if these are option A or option B solutions. And the truth is that when we spend money on mental health care, we save money long term. And that's across the board. That is for chronic symptom management and condition management at the community level, to those most severe cases getting access to the 24/7 care they need. When we have, for example, the system we have now, I have toured the facilities that still exist in Cherokee and Independence. They will get calls in a single day that if we kicked everybody out and took all those placement requests, we still wouldn't have room in our current facilities. That puts stress on our emergency care system as people wait in emergency rooms to find that permanent relocation or that long-term relocation that they need. So that puts stress on the rest of the system, also put a lot of costs in the rest of the system. The same thing with corrections-based care. If we wait for someone with a severe level of mental illness to commit an offense that lands them in our correctional system, we not only are still providing the mental health care that was missing, but now we have a certain term of years that's associated with housing that person. Now it's a $50,000 to $60,000 a year prospect, as opposed to something that might have been addressed with either community-based or a mental health institute facility.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is there a reason besides funding state salaries that the priority is reopening mental health institutions as opposed to putting the equivalent amount of dollars in the community? Where's the most bang for your buck there?
Well, and to me, it really is both. And I'm not trying to avoid your question. I'm saying that there are situations where someone has an advanced case of a mental disorder that they're not going to fit neatly into a community-based program. They're not going to fit neatly into a nursing home. I talked to a man whose brother was in the Clarinda facility at the time it was closed. Within 3 weeks, his brother was dead, because the only option they had for him was to take him to a nursing home. And the nursing home's not equipped to provide that level of care and supervision for that level of mental illness. And that's the reality that happened multiple times after those facilities were closed. The problem didn't go away. The community-based system was not able to accept and take on that additional responsibility. We just had really horrible consequences for the decision. And that's playing out over and over again as we see struggles from emergency room transfers to long-term care not coordinated right now in our state. And it's putting stress on public safety, it's putting stress on corrections. The reality is we need to approach it at both levels and not pick one or the other to be the winner or loser in the mental health system.
What exactly would you do to address the problems related to the Medicaid privatization? Are you going to roll that back entirely, and if so, what do you replace it with?
So I was one of the co-sponsors in the Iowa Senate that had every single Democratic senator as well as our independent senators sign on to cancel the MCO, Managed Care Organization contracts, and get us back to a transition within 6 months of making sure Iowans are taking care of Iowans in terms of their mental health care need, or excuse me, their health care needs. And in Medicaid, that's something that really has been a disaster. The privatization was carried out without involving the stakeholders, without involving the people who need to understand how we best care for our own citizens, some of our most vulnerable in this state. When we look at Governor Reynolds' condition of the state address, one of the things she said unmistakably and clearly, mistakes were made in privatizing Medicaid. But it's not leadership to just point and say there's the mistake. It's leadership to offer the solution, to address it. What the bill that I co-sponsored was to have that 6-month transition to figure out the best way to do it. No one's out there shouting that fee-for-service all by itself was the greatest way to do it and had no faults. But we need to have a meaningful long-term solution, and that has to be undertaken with stakeholders involved to figure out the best plan. But the most important thing that I think is missing is we've got out-of-state companies that are getting Iowa dollars and have every incentive to delay and deny payments. And that is causing real problems, not just for the patients. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Iowans who are struggling to get the services they need. But we're hearing unanimously from providers. Providers are telling us that if they don't see a change in this system, they are going to have to start scaling back their services. That doesn't just put Medicaid recipients at risk. That's everyone. That's everyone's health care that is diminished when a provider has to scale back services because they can't afford to keep operating at these levels of costs and expenses when you see delays and denials from these out-of-state managed care organizations. It's the wrong way to do it.
The problem that the state was facing before they went to privately managed health care was that you've got the second largest expense in your budget that was completely unpredictable. They didn't know how much they were going to be spending year to year, and when Medicaid ran over, then that would take money away from education and other priorities. Right. So how do you solve that problem without going to the managed care, privatized managed care extreme?
Well, you don't solve it by opening the trap door. And that's the problem, is yes, there were ways that we could have improved this system, but rather than dropping people through a trap door with a sudden onset of privatization with no real plan forward, and seeing the results that we have seen that were pretty predictable by the way this was done, you bring in the stakeholders and you do figure out ways that we can manage the costs and ways that we can do this the responsible way. One of the things that we saw in the late debates in the Senate was I co-sponsored an amendment that would have taken the most severe cases out of the MCO system and brought them back into an Iowa-based fee-for-service system because they're the ones that have the most at risk when the privatized system fails. We saw real progress on that. In fact, we were, I believe, one vote short of getting that passed in a Senate that is controlled with, Democrats 10 members short of the majority. So, I mean, that's a real change in terms of policy. People are recognizing it as a problem, and there are ways we can get about taking care of Iowans the right way and controlling the costs.
Even if you deal with the Medicaid privatization, it's easy for me to say, you still are going to have issues with people having access to health care in Iowa. What do you think are the biggest concerns there, and how do you solve them?
So again, I mean, I can't emphasize it enough. It is the singular biggest threat to health care in Iowa. When you have providers, and I'm talking about, during this campaign, I've gone to rural hospitals, I've gone to clinics, I've gone to urban hospitals. It is unanimous. It is every provider saying, this system is not sustainable for us. That is the biggest threat. So that's the first thing. The other thing is we do need to find ways to get more people covered with the health insurance they need. And I've also offered legislation to do that, co-sponsoring a bill that would expand the Hawkeye program. I'm on the Healthy and Well Kids in Iowa board. I've experienced a number of conversations with providers on how well that system works for them. They get reimbursed on time. It is a reliable system. We can add more security to a program like Hawkeye and not be at the mercy of the Trump administration to come through with CHIP funding, but actually have people buying in, taking some of the budget burden off of those families for their health insurance, where their employer may have a good single plan but a very expensive family plan, and have that more affordable option, get those children covered with a more accessible healthcare network, and have a quality result from that. That solves both ends of the problems. We get more people with the coverage they need and have more security in our children's health insurance program in Iowa.
Would you allow people to buy into the state employee, just adults to buy into the state employee?
I think we can look at a lot of options, but I want to make sure we walk before we run. And the worst thing we can do for health care in Iowa is set up a benefits or insurance system that is not sustainable. And if we do that, if we go off on the wrong direction, it will be very difficult not only to unwind the problems that occur as people slip through the cracks and see real struggles in getting the health care they need, but to further the conversation on how we do on a larger scale fix some of those health care problems in our nation.
What about, what is your assessment right now of the state of women's health care in the state after the closure of Planned Parenthood clinics around the state, and what can be done about that?
Well, again, it's not as if this wasn't a predictable outcome. One of the first bills I debated as a state senator was Senate File 2 that defunded Planned Parenthood and promised to offer this new network of healthcare services across the state that would spring up magically once Planned Parenthood was defunded. What we saw was the reality that 4 clinics were closed almost immediately and no new network has sprung up in their place. That's cost access for thousands of Iowa women to reproductive health care services, particularly across rural Iowa. And we look at southeast Iowa, where I grew up, there were 2 clinics closed. So we're talking about people having to travel a very long distance to simply get regular reproductive health care services. So that's a major consequence. And as we were pointing that out on the Senate floor, as we were discussing the merits of that proposal, rather than talk about access to women's health care, rather than talk about the merits of the idea, when I brought up my opposition, I was called out on the Senate floor and I was told by the floor manager of the bill, Senator Boulton, I don't know how old you are, but your mother could have chosen for you not to be here. So this was never about women's health care. This was never about expanding services. This was about an ideological battle line between political parties. And unfortunately, women's health care suffered as a result.
I'm going to jump in here before I go on. Okay. let's talk about taxes. The sweeping income tax bill passed by the legislature this year. Would you just repeal that, or are there other things that you would do? What are the principles that you would lay out for changes in the tax code?
Yeah, no, the message that was being, screaming at the legislature this year was not we need a giant tax cut for the wealthiest of Iowans. We need to reform the corporate tax credits, exemptions, and giveaway system. When you're going through ongoing budget cycles, at a time when the economy is doing well in Iowa, we've got a 17-year low in unemployment, yet we saw a rate of the rainy day fund last year. We saw mid-year budget cuts, followed by a budget that made most of those mid-year cuts permanent, followed by another emergency transfer last summer. One of the first things that Governor Reynolds did in office was to emergency transfer funds to make ends meet temporarily until we got to the legislative session where appropriations, the budgeting process, started with another round of cuts in the middle of the year that actually didn't take effect until the very end of the year on state agencies. So here we are seeing the effects of fiscal mismanagement, and yet rather than dealing with the cause of the mismanagement and the crisis that we are in, this legislature and governor pushed through what will end up being, when it takes full effect, around $1 billion of lost revenue to the state. We have a $7.4 billion budget. You're going to take $1 out of every $7 out of the budget when we already are not keeping up with the cost of inflation in our schools, when we're already seeing health care not adequately funded, when we're already seeing DHS staffing levels so low that we've lost over 1,300 field workers. Caseworkers aren't keeping up with caseloads to the point where we've had 2 children die of starvation with supervised cases because our caseworkers simply cannot keep up with the work in front of them. So I voted no on that tax bill. That probably was not a surprise at the end of this answer. But I will tell you, I think it took us down the absolute wrong direction. And overwhelmingly, the benefits of that tax bill will go to the wealthiest Iowans. People that are doing well already are now going to see more resources, while people making under $200,000 are probably going to see about $2.50 a week in benefit from this on the average.
Okay, but the question is, your governor, what do you do now?
Yeah. So again, I deal with the cause and effect problem that we ignored from the very beginning, and that is start peeling back some of those corporate tax credits, exemptions, and giveaways. We could have been very strategic about those things. We weren't. And as a result, we've had the consequences of unpredictable budgeting and overextension. For example, the consumables and manufacturing exemption. Rather than using the legislative process to make it a targeted credit program to help companies that are on the brink of struggling to make ends meet, this was just a blanket exemption. And that blanket exemption was projected to cost about $20 million a year in the state budget. The first year it was implemented, it cost about $86 million. Imagine if our schools could be off by 4 times their budget and the state just had to deal with it. But that's not how it works. And examples like that are throughout these giveaways and credit programs. I call it on the campaign trail corporate coupons. And when you base economic development on transactions, you create a transactional economic development program. What happens? When that coupon expires, they go out and that company is going to shake down Oklahoma or Mississippi or Kansas or whatever state has the next coupon. It's something we've seen play out across the nation. Iowa's economy is better than that. And I think as we see these giveaways grow and then layer on an irresponsible budget-busting tax bill, we're going to see more problems to market our real strength in terms of economic development, our workforce. We have the most educated, skilled, qualified workforce, a dependable workforce that employers want to have access to here in Iowa. We market to that strength if we can keep those skilled workers in Iowa and recruit the next generation to come to Iowa. We don't do that with corporate giveaways. We do that by investing in the things that those giveaways cost us, quality education.
If you were to take away as many of these corporate tax credits, et cetera, as you think is feasible, what does that add up to? I mean, how much money are you going to get back from that?
Yeah, well, it's going to be obviously dependent on who we have in the legislature to work with, but I think by being more strategic, by being more targeted, we can actually start peeling back $200 to $300 million a year. The commercial property tax program is one of those things that has cost our state dearly. It's been so unsuccessful that one of the bills on the last day of the session was to walk away from the backfill and just abandon that program and leave local governments to their own devices on dealing with the mess.
So you still have $700 or $800 million in tax cuts on the books, even
Yeah.
if you do that. So how do you balance the budget then with that?
So you balance the budget by, again, you look at a number of these exemption credit programs. You can look at, as I gave the examples before, the blanket exemption on consumables and manufacturing. You look at targeting the commercial property tax legislation to the first $300,000 or $400,000 of value, so we're not padding the profits of high-rise developments in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids and other large cities. You can look at, of course, the one that probably gets the most attention is the research activities credit, where we're actually writing 6- and 7-figure checks that go out of state based on the way that program was structured. So there are a lot of those things that we can get at and create some revenue. The other thing is, in the budgeting process, again, I'm someone that's on the appropriations committee, I'm involved in the budget process. What strikes me as really unforgivable is when we see a lot of these cuts to things that actually are revenue positive in our state. Funding for our courts, for example, when we have adequate funding for the specialty courts, they bring in a lot more resources than they cost our state, and not just in dollars and cents in court fees, but if you look at someone who goes through our drug courts program, if we can go through a diversion program and have that individual actually contributing positively to the economy as opposed to being incarcerated, it's not just the dollars and cents that we save in terms of the money spent from the general fund, but it's the added value to economic development that can come from that individual. That's plainly apparent in things that give us federal matching dollars that have been cut. A lot of those things really were done without that foresight to, beyond what it saves us to cut this year, what does it cost next year and beyond? And that was a frustration that I had this past year.
I didn't hear you in answering Cathy's question, saying that you would undo the tax cuts that were just passed. A lot of those are income tax, not corporate tax.
Right.
And even with the $200 to $300 million that you may be able to save by rescinding some of those tax benefits for business, would that be enough for the programs that you want to fund in? And if not, where would you get the money?
Sure. And again, I think it's a two-part question, right? I think the first answer was that we shouldn't have gone through this large tax cut bill in the first place. The second is, if we're going to do income tax reduction, it needs to be done in a strategic way that helps those Iowans that did not see wage growth this past 8 years. The failure of this administration is markedly in their failure to deliver the promised 25% increase in earnings for Iowans. It didn't happen. In fact, we missed it by the whole 25%. If you look at Iowa versus the rest of the nation, the last 10 years, adjusted for inflation, we were behind the national average. We didn't even keep up and tread water with the rest of the nation despite all this investment. So if we're going to actually do something to provide relief to families that haven't seen income growth, yeah, we can target some of that benefit to those making under $200,000 a year. But then you see the rest of where that tax bill went and where it's going to be truly expensive in the end, qualified business income, those types of things, they shouldn't be there. And we're going to work to repeal those parts of it.
You mentioned being on the Appropriations Committee.
Right.
Are there programs in state government at this point that you consider wasteful? I mean, just not a priority anymore?
Well, I would say, when we started this legislature, Governor Reynolds stood in front of the legislature and said the first bill she was going to sign was a monumental bill on water quality. We didn't see a monumental bill on water quality. We saw the leftovers from last session that couldn't get through the legislative process because it wasn't good enough to do that become the monumental water quality bill that was promised. And what it's going to do is actually be a very expensive program that does very little to unimpaired waterways, does not have a watershed approach, does not involve monitoring, and doesn't do what a real monumental bill would have done. Like my bill, which was to fund the Water and Land Legacy Trust Fund that voters asked us to do, with 60% of the vote in 2010. That has only increased in popularity since that time. Voters want to see a monumental water quality bill. They want to see real resources put behind it. That's a proposal that I think is going to wastefully spend hundreds of millions of dollars without really seeing a measurable impact in our waterways. That's why I voted against it.
Let's talk about education for a minute. What is your overall vision for education in the state? Where do you want to be after 4 years as governor? What are your priorities?
Yeah, so education is a very important issue to me. A lot of people may not know this, but I actually went to Simpson College to be a high school government and history teacher. That was my original plan. If you don't believe me, all you have to do is to verify that I got the coaching endorsement to go with it. So I was serious about teaching in an Iowa classroom on social studies. When it comes to our schools, I think we have three main threats in education in Iowa right now. The number one threat is the systemic underfunding. To make funding for our schools a budget priority again is going to be a focus of my administration. We have always prided ourselves on having world-class public schools despite the economic circumstances. Through the farm crisis, we have always made sure that our public school system was a success. That means funding it as a success. And when this legislature,
does that mean?
So when
in terms of per pupil spending increases, I mean, what are we talking about?
Right. So when this legislature funds at 1% allowable growth, or what we now call supplemental state aid, and then 3 months later says we can afford $100 million for qualified business income tax relief, that tells me that there's a very inconsistent priority message. If we had an extra $100,000 to put towards education, that takes us from 1% to around 3% allowable growth or supplemental state aid. It means making it a priority. Really, it does come down to that. The second main threat is where we're going to find those 22-year-olds that we need to start their careers in education in Iowa. Because right now, the environment that we have created, we're seeing a lack of support for higher education result in rising tuition costs. So that student, that 22-year-old with the education degree, is going to graduate and find that they have a high debt load. They're going to go out into a public school system that, because of the collective bargaining bill that this legislature and this administration pushed through, they will never see a wage increase that allows them to keep up with inflation based on the rules that were created for negotiation in that legislation. They'll have less and less of a voice on their own health insurance through that legislation, so that cost is going to go up. So you're going to see effective wage cuts for those teachers from day one as they start their careers. They're going to work in an underfunded classroom because of the systemic failure to underfund education, so put more of their own resources into the classroom to be successful in teaching the students in front of them. And now we're hearing from the administration threats to IPERS as we know it, so their retirement security doesn't look so good. When you factor all of those things together, we're telling young aspiring teachers that maybe Iowa is not the place to start your career. Because people with a passion for teaching are going to teach, and they're going to find a way to do that. But more and more, they're going to be looking outside of Iowa to start that career. So those are two main threats. And the third, of course, is the potential for vouchers or education savings accounts to come in. We saw a bill introduced by the President of the Senate late in the legislative session. So it's clearly a priority that has been discussed. After 8 years of underfunding our schools, after effective cuts, now the plan is to run. If you take $3,000 or $4,000 per student out of our budgeting process for education, that's going to have a major impact on the future of our schools in this state. So those things, I think, are very clear threats. And then the last thing I'll mention in terms of the overall vision for education is to get back to where we were before, where we didn't run the risk of different parts of our education system lobbying against each other. I mean, that should have been unimaginable, yet we started to see more and more this last 2 years. We don't need independent colleges and universities feeling like they have to defend themselves from state universities because the resources are dwindling for both. When we see community colleges worried about their funding at the expense of higher education elsewhere, when we see, again, a system where we pick winners and losers even among our schools in terms of areas of content education, it's great to say we want to invest in STEM, but it shouldn't be at the expense of language arts or fine arts. I mean, as we pick winners and losers, we lose focus on the one thing that Iowa made itself committed to doing, to make sure that every student, no matter where their zip code, no matter who their parents were, could reach his or her full potential in an Iowa-based education, starting at preschool all the way through community college, through an independent college or a state university or a skilled trade apprenticeship program, but you can reach your full potential here in Iowa with a quality system. It's the whole system being successful. It really is.
Other than just putting more money into the system overall, I mean, what do you expect out of it? I mean, how do you know if the money that you're putting in is showing results?
How do you know the money you're putting in is showing results? Well, the first result that we can see is the negative result that we've seen in the past few years. Very clearly, failing to fund higher education at appropriate levels results in higher student debt load. That's a negative result that's going to make it so more and more students either don't pursue those programs or find other ways to pursue them outside the state of Iowa. That's going to be a problem for our state long term. If we want to have skilled workers for the next generation, we can't have them leaving our state to find educational opportunities. So there, I mean, some of those negative results have to be offset. In terms of the positives, what things can we hope to see? In my Senate district, we have Finley Elementary, which has been an exemplary program in terms of increasing funding and support for fine arts. The result that they saw there was that students were more successful across the board when they engaged in fine arts programming. It supported more parental involvement. It supported better engagement in terms of other content areas, reading scores, mathematics. When students found that they had an aptitude or an interest in school in some other way, it helped them in other content areas. So those are the results that I think we can expect to see if we allow students to thrive at the things that they're good at and get the support they need for things that they're struggling in.
Do you favor universal preschool?
I do. I think we should have an aggressive universal preschool program because I think it does two things. Number one, it gets the learning process started on equal footing for students across our state. And number two, it addresses a critical need in terms of simply child care needs for a lot of working families in Iowa. And I think those two things lead to very positive results. I'm someone, because of that teacher education program, I understand. It didn't matter how inspirational I was as your government teacher in the 12th grade. If we lost you in grades 2 through 4 because you identified as a dumb kid early on in the educational process, because you started behind others, because you didn't get the individualized attention that you needed early on, we probably were not going to see you succeed in those later years where maybe you did have an interest in history or social studies, but you checked out of the educational process early on because it wasn't for you. We can prevent that with universal preschool, with more adequate funding for small class sizes in those early elementary years.
I also wanted to ask a question I asked another candidate. The teacher leader program has been a place where there has been significant investment in K through 12. Also, a lot more mentoring of beginning teachers. Do you think that's a good investment or not?
Yeah, and I think we can get creative on a lot of things like that. You know, I think we can involve those students that are pursuing education degrees in more expanded practicums and more expanded summer reading programs and things to maximize the resources that we have before us. I think those are all good things. The more we can engage in different ways in the education process, we'll have positive results. But the core threat is if we continue to underfund the classrooms themselves and see more consolidation and rising class sizes, then we aren't able to address the bigger picture, which is to make sure that in those core content areas, students are getting the individualized attention that they need, both for advancement, those talented and gifted students moving ahead as they should, as well as those that are struggling getting the support they need to progress through the education system. I mean, that's a serious concern. We have schools that are talking about not being able to replace textbooks, let alone be able to implement new technologies in the classroom or do the things that we're learning we need to do in terms of special needs education, ELL education, the things that can be real equalizers in our economy start with K through 12 and preschool education.
One of the consistent Republican talking points is citing a report that says Iowa has invested in K through 12 education at a higher rate than any other state.
Yeah.
How does that square with you saying we have consistently underfunded?
Well, you just, you know what, I will tell you, when we had the Condition of the State address, we heard the same message, right? We have record funding for our schools, we're doing better than ever. Well, that's a tough sell to our school boards. That's a tough sell to our teachers in the classrooms. That's a tough sell to our students in those classrooms that are seeing the effects of failing to keep up with the costs of learning materials. And so, yeah, I think there are ways you can slice and dice statistics to make it look a lot better than it really is. But the reality is where the rubber meets the road is how our classrooms are functioning and how they're funded. And over again, we see very real and very unfortunate examples of how the threat of resources there for education is hurting the quality of our schools.
One of the traditional conundrums of education in Iowa is that the money follows the students, and there aren't enough students in some rural areas to have a lot of the kind of programs that you just talked about, and make them function effectively. So for a two-part question, how do you deal with that education issue in rural Iowa? And secondly, how do you try to bring some families back to rural Iowa?
Well, probably one of the less sexy topics in education is talking about the area education agencies, because a lot of people don't really understand how area education agencies work and how really they are pretty effective at minimizing the gaps between mid-sized and large schools and those small rural schools in terms of having the resources they need for students across the board. And again, our area education agencies have been really hit hard by budget decisions the past few years. That's one of the key equalizers for rural Iowa education. The other thing is we're going to continue to see a decline in rural Iowa educational opportunities as we see a decline in the rural Iowa economy. And I think there are a lot of rural Iowa voters this year who should be looking left, looking right, and saying, have the last 8 years really worked out for me? When you look at this administration's priority, in the face of all the budget problems that we've had, for Governor Reynolds to walk out and do a press conference announcing the state is going to give $20 million in coupons to Apple, the wealthiest corporation on the planet, rather than supporting economic development in rural areas across the state, that has to be a real frustration that hits home. $20 million could have funded over 260 Main Street grants, partnered state resources with local resources, and stirred economic development in our small communities that really need that help. That's going to be something that I think is going to be a big part of the debate this fall.
I'll ask you a question I asked another candidate earlier. The Iowa fertilizer plant, our reporting showed that during the construction phases that there was a lot of money in some of those small rural communities, and that they were getting a lot of customers, and they were able to use that money to modernize and expand their businesses. So is that really the wrong approach for Iowa?
Yeah, I think there's construction involved with 260 Main Street grants across the state. I mean, it's a matter of what we spend our efforts and focus doing and what's the long-term payoff. The long-term payoff in projects like Orascom or the Apple handout is that once that construction is done, what's the effect on the economy long-term? Well, those are pretty unskilled jobs that have been brought in here at pretty small numbers for the cost of what those economic development programs would do. If you take that same concept and you apply it to repairing our highways and bridges, if you apply it to improving storefronts, if you apply it to being a good partner to economic development in rural and mid-sized communities, if you make sure we're spending on things that Iowa can actually be positioned to succeed on, things like value-added agriculture, getting us more invested in adding value to corn and soybeans before they leave our state's border, things like biodegradable plastics in addition to biofuels. Those things we have a unique opportunity to do really well if we invest smartly. I mean, we have so many natural economic development advantages that the states that rely on the quicksand economics of corporate giveaways don't. We have two of the nation's largest rivers as our borders. We have the intersection of 80 and 35 to transport goods around the country. If we have the ability to get goods to market, if we have the ability to transport goods around the country, we're going to see the ability to maintain some of our key manufacturing, especially light manufacturing in these mid-sized communities, and expand it in things that we're good at. Those value-added agricultural products, the renewable energy, answering the problem of climate change with Iowa wind turbines and Iowa solar technology is something that has a long-term payoff. The rest of what we've seen has been pretty short-sighted.
How is this not just substituting your priorities for Republican priorities in giving subsidies or incentives?
Because their priorities are wrong. That's why. I mean,
Well, I mean, there's talking about the approach, right?
Yeah.
And then there's using the same approach to just fund
Right.
different businesses.
Well, but again, if we're smart about it, if we target it, if we do it in things that Iowa really is positioned to succeed, if we see a long-term payoff to those things, some of them make sense. But when we do it in a ham-handed way, that when a company that has a really attractive sticker to slap on the side of a building is the priority over long-term economic development, over long-term investment in a specialized skilled workforce and work set, we're not going to see the long-term results.
Somebody jump in here.
If you win the nomination, how do you make the case to a General Electric that put Trump in office or helped
Yeah.
put him in office, that put Branstad Reynolds in office, that put this current legislative majority in office? How do you make that case for your
Well,
election?
I think we've seen as this campaign has unfolded, one of the biggest bases of support that I have are a lot of those blue-collar workers that were distracted this past election cycle. I'll be perfectly honest. When I was at shift changes at manufacturing facilities here in the Des Moines area on Election Day in 2016, I was encouraging people to get out to vote, and I heard from multiple people, I'm going to vote for you, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. And the reason for that I think was there was I had a message about talking about improving workplace rights and safety and valuing our workforce. And it was a message that wasn't very broadly trumpeted by the rest of the Democratic Party in 2016. I think that's going to be key to getting some of those votes that were distracted away from the base of the party in the past couple of election cycles to come back home, especially after what we saw this past legislative session, a frontal assault on workplace rights. There's no mistaking what the priorities were of this administration. It was not 25% income growth. It was not creating 200,000 new jobs. It was getting at those workplace rights, a bill that blew up 40 years of peace in terms of public sector bargaining rights. That was the exact wrong approach, to tell voters out there who work in employment settings from not just public employment, such as our firefighters, our police officers, our construction employees, our public health nurses and social workers, but also the broader set. And when you include the attack on workers' compensation benefits, I'm talking about people in the building and construction trades, people in manufacturing across Iowa, they were told that they were not only not a priority for this administration, that they were the enemy of this administration. I was proud to lead the Senate Democrats through 26 consecutive hours of session fighting that bill. That's going to be something that's going to be important for a swing group of voters that feels like the priorities of this administration have not been theirs.
I haven't heard you mention the minimum wage. What is the right minimum wage for Iowa?
Yeah, so first things first on the minimum wage. We're behind 5 of our 6 neighboring states. So if the secret to economic prosperity and wage growth is to have a low minimum wage, we should be seeing something that outkicks the rest of the country. But we haven't seen wage growth. What we've seen is stagnant wages. And the real reason for that is we haven't focused on it. I introduced legislation last year that would have taken the Polk County wage at the end of the phase-in statewide. So we would have insulated every single Iowan from seeing what happened last year, a wage cut on the minimum wage in 5 Iowa counties. I believe that we can get to a point where we can get to $15 an hour. I think it is phased in to get there by 2024 in my plan.
Why take so long? What do you need the phase-in for?
Well, I think we do want to make sure that we don't see a sudden impact on particularly the small businesses that we need to thrive through a transition. And I think we can get there by doing it in a responsible way. I also think that at the end of that, we should be indexing it to inflation, so we don't wait every 10 years to have a discussion of do we increase the minimum wage by 25%, by 50%, by 100%, because we haven't kept up with it so long. I think we have more reliable, predictable economic growth if we get out of this starvation diet in terms of minimum wage increases till it gets to a critical point where we have to do something to address the critical need.
Would you have any sort of exemptions in the minimum wage for jobs that might primarily go to teenagers or unskilled?
I don't think that's the right approach. I think when you create more exemptions like that, they're more readily exploited and can disadvantage a workforce and a workforce population. So if you look at my legislation that I passed, it does not have those expanded exemptions.
What would you say to rural Iowans who say they're sick of tax and spend liberals, and you sound like a tax and spend liberal? How would you attract them to your campaign?
We've got a whole lot of tax and giveaway Republicans right now, and it's not working out for rural Iowa. It really is not. These credits and exemptions have to be paid somehow, and working families are not seeing the giveaways that some of the wealthiest corporations in the nation and on the planet have seen. So the real struggle in rural Iowa is maintaining the quality of life that is at risk right now. And when you look at communities like Parkersburg, Parkersburg is a community that obviously was hit very hard by a tornado and on the brink of disaster. Out of that has come new housing development, new business development, and all of a sudden people around the Cedar Valley are saying, you know what, that small town lifestyle is pretty good. I'm going to look at a home in Parkersburg. It's been inspired by investments in community improvement in that area. Right now you have Republicans that are focused on one-off projects in Waukee for short-term economic development and growth rather than more sustainable economic development and community improvement. You look at programs like Vision Iowa. It was a Democratic governor that invested in local community development and growth for the long term. That's the thing that I think has been missing in rural Iowa, and particularly if you are fiscally conservative in rural Iowa, this administration has left you far behind.
One of the things that the electorate responded to, though, when Governor Branstad ran again, was he argued against the debt that was involved in the bonding, particularly for the iJobs program, but also with the state still paying off the debt for Vision Iowa. I mean, how do you respond? How do you make the case that that kind of program is fiscally responsible?
Well, I think you ask people that actually saw the benefit of those programs if they worked out well or did not work out well for their community. You look at Columbus Junction, where I grew up. You've got a civic building there that has helped anchor and transform the downtown area with new development. I think it's a positive impact in that community. When you look at where the shift has been, I think it is hard to argue with a straight face to Iowa voters for this administration to say we've been fiscally responsible. The last 2 years of headlines say otherwise. And it is a set of misplaced priorities that has led to a very unpredictable budget process, that has led to mid-year budget cuts in good economic times. If you look at the budget struggles that happened a few years ago, you can see national recessions associated with them. We're not seeing that problem in Iowa right now. We're seeing an economically stable time in Iowa, yet we've seen a rate of the rainy day fund and emergency budget transfers. I think it's hard for this administration to argue we need more time to get our story straight on the economy and fiscal responsibility.
Of course, the Republican response to that is that it's not that we have a revenue problem; it's a spending problem. We haven't controlled the size. You keep growing the size of spending in state government, right, and your revenues aren't keeping up.
Yeah, and the fastest growing item in state government in terms of spending are those corporate tax credits, exemptions, giveaways. And there's your spending problem. That's the difference maker right now.
I want to just circle back to the environment. You talked about water quality already, but how do you balance the fact that agriculture is Iowa's number one?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a major driver of our economy.
Sure.
With the fact that we have water pollution associated with livestock, and also with the fertilizer for commodity row crop farming.
Right. I think when you talk to those century farmers and heritage farmers across Iowa, you find that it's really not as big of an urban-rural divide in terms of making sure we're managing our soil properly, that we have quality and safe drinking water, as well as quality wildlife habitat for hunting and fishing opportunities that are part of a quality of life rural Iowans expect. I think when we start talking about it really in terms of what we want to accomplish, I think there are a lot of shared values out there that have been untapped in terms of approaching this from a solutions approach. Rather than fixing blame, it's time to start fixing problems in terms of water quality, in terms of soil management, for the long-term success of our state. It doesn't do any farmer any good to continue to see more and more of our topsoil float down the Mississippi and end up in the Mississippi Delta. And if we want to talk about real long-term success of our Iowa agricultural economy, we've got to get a handle on topsoil runoff. Things like the Leopold Center taught us early on, cover crops were going to be a big part of the solution there. Yet this administration and this legislature has unfunded the Leopold Center as opposed to keeping its mission secure. When you start talking about those sustainable approaches, you're talking about the long-term viability and success of a critical natural resource in Iowa, our soil and our water. Beyond that, I'm very proud of the work that my wife Andrea does in terms of recreational opportunities. Think about the economic development that can happen if we do some of the work that she's been doing for the past several years. She's the Trails Director for the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, expanding biking trails, hiking trails, water trails. We want people to come to Iowa and enjoy our natural resources. We're not going to be able to do that if you come to Iowa and you see our natural resources in states of disrepair. If you come to a public beach and see the beach closed sign, toxic algae or bacteria levels. So these are some shared values and shared priorities of Iowans. That's why you saw 60% of Iowans want to do the Iowa Water Land Legacy Trust Fund as a priority. That didn't split neatly along urban and rural lines. Iowans recognize the threat there. Iowans want a long-term solution.
Does the voluntary approach to, for example, the soil and water conservation, is that enough at this point? Does it still have more potential?
It still has more potential, and I think one of the things that we can do better in terms of soil management and water quality is infrastructure improvements. We can help two parts of our economy at the same time with investing in those agricultural infrastructure, things like submergible buffers and things that we can make here in Iowa and help some of our mid-sized communities succeed with light manufacturing, as well as partner with some of our farmers across the state that are looking for opportunities to be better stewards of the land. And this is something that actually I remember Jim Leach talking about when he was in Congress. I remember an op-ed that he wrote, I think it was in the Des Moines Register, about conservation and conservatism. And those two things do go together. And I think there are a lot of people that we can bring to the table and unite on that.
Would you put a moratorium on concentrated animal agriculture, CAFOs, or allow more local control, or any other regulations?
Yeah, I've supported local control. I think the most important thing we can do is to make sure that people that are affected by the siting of a new operation have a voice in it. I think we can affect new changes to make the master matrix much more meaningful in terms of the siting of operations. I think those two things have to be #1 priorities in terms of managing the expansion of those industries. I also have a clear record of supporting the rights of people that are affected directly by nuisances to be able to recover for the damages that are done to them.
I'm not hearing a lot of differences in policy between you and the other Democratic candidates in the primary. What do you see as the key policy differences between you and your opponents?
Yeah, I think some of the things that I've actually planned to do as opposed to just reaction to some of the key issues, right? I think you look at the things that I've introduced in the legislature this year. I've introduced legislation that was inspired by State Treasurer Fitzgerald in terms of Retirement Savings Iowa. While Republicans have talked about threatening the security of IPERS for 300,000 Iowans and other public pension programs, we can actually make sure more Iowans are saving for their retirement. And again, that's a long-term payoff item. That's something that if we have an option for small and mid-sized employers to be able to attract and retain a quality workforce, because right now they can't afford a 401k program or to set up a simple IRA, but could have a state-managed secure IRA program that all they have to do is simply the management of the account where they send in the resources that the employee voluntarily sends in, whether that's $20 a week or $50 a paycheck, whatever they want to do, immediately start saving for the long-term future. I've introduced a paid family leave bill. Gets Iowa ahead of the curve on something that a lot of the nation is talking about. We're seeing a lot of bipartisan support for across the nation. Let's make Iowa a leader on something like that. Those are going to be things that will make the difference in terms of that family that's looking for the place that they're going to relocate to start their careers and their futures, or those Iowans that we want, our best and brightest, to choose to stay here. What's that plan forward? Where's that vision headed? I've been talking a lot about taking us away from this endless cycle of planning for the next 6 months to 24 months and start sharing a vision for what Iowa can and should be doing so we are the successful state we want to be in 6 to 24 years.
Some of your critics have said that as a first-term state senator, you don't have the experience to be governor. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, in terms of this Democratic field, I'm the only one that's held elective office in state government, and so those 2 years are a big advantage. I also think those current relationships that I have with legislators, with senators, with representatives, with Republicans and Democrats will be critical to getting things done as governor. You look at Tom Vilsack. He was successful as governor because of his legislative experience, because he had to deal with divided government his whole 8 years. But he was able to accomplish things because he was knowledgeable about the legislative process and knowledgeable about those individuals in that process that were critical to the success of our state. The other thing I think that is important about my background is the fact that I do come from rural Iowa and now represent a more urban area of the state and can help bring that urban-rural divide closer together. And I think that's something that I've worked to do as well. So I think my experience is very relevant. My 12 years as a workers' rights attorney is important. My work in education, not only being someone who obtained a teaching license, student taught at Indianola High School and did some substitute teaching during law school, but I've taught for 10 years in higher education as an adjunct professor. Making sure that we see that whole system succeed isn't something that is just a talking point for me. It's based on my experiences in the classroom. So I think when we look at the breadth of experience, I think I offer a lot in this race.
The fetal heartbeat bill it took Iowa to a whole different place when it comes to abortion restrictions. Right. Depending, now we're waiting to see obviously what happens in the courts, but if you were governor, where would you like to reset that needle when it comes to a balance between the rights of the unborn and the rights of mothers?
We have pretty clear instructions from Roe versus Wade on where the state's interest and ability to regulate abortion comes. And I think Iowa had a pretty good balance and structure before this past 2 years. So I would see us restore where we were, reset the clock 2 years back as opposed to 40 years back, which we saw the legislature do this year.
So before the 20-week ban then.
I just wanted to follow up on that too. And is it if you became governor, because I'm sure for some people this is going to become a referendum on this fetal heartbeat bill. We've already hearing from some people who say they are going to vote against her because of that. If you become governor and there's still a Republican legislature or the Republicans still have control, is there anything that you can do on an executive basis to stop that from going into effect and to maintain the status quo?
Well, I think it's going to be resolved by the courts because I think this is unconstitutional as it was written. I even pointed that out in the floor debate. Not only is it unconstitutional in terms of violating the protections of Roe versus Wade that have been routinely upheld, but also I think the way this bill was drafted, it was irresponsibly vague to be able to enforce. And I think that's going to be the irony of all of this, is that after all of this debate and discussion over the merits of the bill, the poor drafting from last-minute compromises that are unfortunately part of a legislative process where you have debate on a bill at the end of session at 1:30 in the morning, will end up being the downfall of this legislation. I think it's very likely that the Iowa Supreme Court will look at this and say, we can't make sense of this legislation the way it's drafted to actually implement it and enforce it. And I think that's one of the likely outcomes here.
And you think that it will go before the state court system as opposed to the federal court?
You know, I don't have any crystal ball, but I think there's a high likelihood that it will be challenged through the state and federal process.
Coming to the end of our time, and we haven't talked about guns, we haven't talked about a bunch of other issues. Why don't I just give you a chance if you have a priority that we haven't discussed that you want to bring up, and then we'll close with the question we've been asking everybody, which is why should the Register endorse you?
Yeah, and I think we talk about things like guns. I'm somebody that has experience in working with law enforcement, and I think that's a huge missing conversation in this whole debate over how we balance the need for critical safety in our communities with the rights of gun owners. I'm somebody who grew up in rural Iowa, took hunter education when I was in middle school. My wife and I are one of those many gun-owning households in Iowa. But we do want to make sure that we are making our community safe and secure. And I think it's been incredibly frustrating to see the exclusion of law enforcement as we've taken up legislation that is critically important to reducing or addressing gun violence in our communities. When the omnibus gun bill was brought up last year, I brought the chief of police from Des Moines, the chief of police from Pleasant Hill, the two communities that I represent, to talk about their concerns and the ability to prosecute perpetrators of gun violence when you expand the use of deadly force to include mistakes. So I think that's an issue where we have a lot of extreme stakeouts of positions, but the reality is most Iowans want to see a balance of safety and security in the community with those gun rights. Unfortunately, the last couple of years, we've seen the needle move in the wrong direction for a lot of Iowans.
What are some
more specific on
in terms of what
you would support in terms of the safety side and the rights side on guns?
Sure.
What do you want to
I
see
mean,
on
we've
that?
seen legislation that would eliminate licensure introduced. Certainly, we're not going to have adequate background checks if we eliminate the licensure process altogether for concealed carry permitting. Expanding the use of deadly force to include mistakes is something that I think was a mistake, because it is a giant hole that any criminal defendant is going to avail themselves of in terms of prosecution of any gun-related fatality, murder prosecution. You look at the expansion of use and carrying of firearms into public settings like the state capitol. We can't sit here and say this could never happen in Iowa. Tom Vilsack became mayor of Mount Pleasant because the mayor of Mount Pleasant was shot at an open government proceeding. We want to make sure citizens feel safe as they come to the Capitol, they come to public forums to talk about controversial issues and not wonder if that's going to end up boiling over to the point where violence will erupt. So I voted against those things. I don't think there's any mystery to where my position is on
Those
that.
are all things you're against.
Mhm.
What are you for?
I think-
What would you support as governor that would change the gun laws of the state?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can look at things like, expanding the background checks and making sure that we have the ability to red flag individuals and prevent, hopefully, very foreseeable incidents of gun violence. Those are things that I think we move forward with. And I think at some point, I do think we have to have a conversation and not just dictation of policy. I think it is going to be important as we see this debate get more and more developed, to have those police officers, those chiefs of police that are seeing the increase of violence that in their communities, talk about the things that they think they need to address it. They're the ones that are making these split-second decisions in our communities, and their voice shouldn't be ignored.
All right. Just the final question then. Why should the Des Moines Register endorse you?
Well, I think it's going to be critically important, and I say it every time I speak. I think that we are going to have an election that is determining the soul of our state here, the long-term vision forward for what Iowa's future should look like. And while I was proud to stand up to some of the things that I thought were very harmful to our state's future, I think it is time for Iowans to start thinking about what our state can be and should be in 10 and 20 years. And that's been a theme of my campaign from the very beginning, to offer that positive vision forward for our state. I think my legislative experience is going to be an asset in terms of understanding how we can not only talk about issues, but get things accomplished in the legislative process. How we address the critical priority of developing our economy the right way, addressing our critical shortage of skilled workers, as well as making sure we have wage growth, doing the things we need to do to bring in the quality workforce we need for the future. I've laid out a vision to do that, and I've made it a point to engage the whole state in this conversation, urban and rural, coming together for the things that we do value and share as values across our state. I think that's going to be what this election truly is about at the end of the day. We're going to determine which vision forward our state should have. I think this one-year audition for Governor Reynolds is going to be one that has a struggle in defining what we can do for the long term as opposed to just weathering the storm.
All right. Thank you very much for your time today. Five other Democratic candidates for governor and the 3 Democrats running for the contested primary for Iowa's 3rd district are also meeting with the Register and staff in the next few weeks. Please check online at DesMoinesRegister.com for the schedule. You can also watch these meetings later. The videos are up, and thank you for watching DesMoinesRegister.com for all of the primary election and general election coverage as well. Thanks. All right.